Hello, everyone. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today in the fourth lecture of Current Topics in Heritage Science, organized within the Hyperion E-RIHS Academy and the European Research Infrastructure for Heritage Science. My name is Tjaša Riavec, and I am a PhD student at the University of Ljubljana, who will be moderating today's lecture. This lecture will focus on the past, present, and future of citizen heritage science, and will be delivered by Dr. Josep Grau-Bové. He is an associate professor of heritage science at the Institute for Sustainable Heritage at University College London. With his team, he uses science and engineering methods to improve the preventive care for heritage. He has pioneered the use of many types of modeling and simulation in heritage, such as computational fluid dynamics and system dynamics. He is the program director at the Sustainable Heritage Masters, a pioneering course where students can specialize in data science for cultural heritage, heritage science, and heritage management. He's also the chair of the Heritage Science Group of the Institute of Conservation. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions that the speaker will answer at the end of the lecture. The lecture will also be available as a recording. So thank you, everyone, and Joseph, the stage is yours.
Thanks a lot, Tjaša, for the introduction, and thanks to the E-RIHS Academy for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I first saw 20 people joining in, then it trickled to 40, now it's 51. I'm starting to get nervous. It's great to be invited to speak about citizen science. It's a topic I love, but it's difficult to be invited to speak for 30 minutes. I much rather be invited to speak for 5 hours. It would be a lot more boring for you, but easier to prepare because I have a lot of material to condense. But let's see if we manage. I'll share my screen if that's all right. Perfect. Tjaša, is it visible?
Yes, it's perfect.
Perfect. Let's go ahead. As Tjaša has told you, I work in heritage science. I'm really interested in developing technologies that help improve the way we take care of heritage. The challenges we face are global, but sometimes the technologies we use are extremely localized on a small scale. And my main mission is to scale up the technology to the scale of the challenges. In the case of citizen science and crowdsourcing methods, it's really a technology that was already big to start with. And when we discuss it, we are very frequent drawn to paying attention only at the developments that have taken place over the last 10 years or so. And we ignore that for as long as there has been people interested in heritage, and as long as these people has been able to communicate to each other, there has been some sort of citizen science. The example I'm starting with, and I'll start with a few short examples of what has happened in the past and use them to outline what I mean by citizen science. So the example I'm talking about right now is the floods in Florence in 1966 that were really damaging for the heritage of the city, and the astonishing response that there was from the public. And I would argue, and this is actually research from a good friend of mine, Paki Kumar, who has been into the archives of Florence and in other places globally to investigate what happened in this event. And I would argue that this has all the elements of a citizen science project. There was a clear call for participation with clear objectives. There were thousands of responses, and the contributions were diverse. The sentence you have in the left was it's one from one of Paki's papers, and it's the statement of the kind of recruitment they wanted. We need everybody, they said, help us in any way you can. The map in the right looks the number of contributions from different countries. You see the spread is global. And these contributions included often money, but also other things: equipment, conservation materials, expertise, advice, and so on. We could go even further and still find examples of citizen science. This example is very famous in the UK. It's something they called the mass observation movement. It was started by some academics that had the idea of asking the British public to examine themselves. They, in several ways and over many years, they look for volunteers that would observe the behavior of people in different contexts. It was simply sometimes sitting at the bus station and seeing what people do. In other instances, it was more involved. As you see on the right, there's a call for participation that consisted on sending them a little bit of text on what do you think happiness is. This kind of citizen science and the very definition of citizen science relies on the fact that we don't consider that citizens are normally using science, right? If that was normal, we wouldn't create a new word for it. But the fact that that science is something that happens within universities almost exclusively, or research centers, and the public don't participate of it, creates this structure. But it didn't used to be like that. There was a time where there were no universities that gave you a badge of officially being a scientist, and anyone with an interest was a citizen, and if they wanted, they could be a scientist. You only need to go roughly 150 years before Britain by mass observation to find things like the different contributions to chemistry that enlightened, normally very rich gentlemen did in the 18th century. I'm not going to go into the detail of this because it's just an example. But I just want to indicate that none of the people who contributed to the first measurements of air quality in the 18th century, none of them studied in a university. They were just rich people with time. They bought each other's books. They copied each other's experiments. They were at the same time citizens and scientists. Of course, after that, we created universities. And after we created universities, we find ourselves in the strange situation where we need to reach out again from universities to citizens in order to bring back something that was actually the only way to engage with science in the past. So I've used some keywords here that deserve clarification. I've spoken of citizen science, and I've also spoken of crowdsourcing. They're sometimes used interchangeably. Myself, in fact, in some of my publications, I have used them interchangeably. And I don't really understand why, because recently, I just by thinking a little bit about the topic, I come to realize there are two distinct things. Citizen science, to me, it means involving non-experts in any part or the total of the scientific method. Hypothesis generation, data collection, data analysis, drawing conclusions from this analysis, two of these parts or all of them. It means devising a system that allows people to participate in some bit or the total of this method. Crowdsourcing, on the other hand, it means something really different. Some people take it as meaning, I am going to do citizen science at a very large scale. But I would like to claim that it has an additional complexity. It means creating a system that harnesses the power of collective intelligence. It's based on the principle that the outcome that you get from a project, it's a lot more than the sum of all the small parts. You cannot do crowdsourcing without creating a platform that enables it. And this platform needs to allow either data collection or data analysis or some other type of contribution that it's tiny from the point of view of the contributor. It can be something they do casually on one afternoon. You are not asking anyone to understand anything in depth or to participate frequently on this project. It could be the tiniest contribution, but the aggregation of all these tiny contributions is where the value is. So a crowdsourcing project can have elements of citizen science. If you use crowdsourcing to empower citizens to become scientists, you can. A citizen science project can have an element of crowdsourcing as well, but they are not exactly the same. I hope this distinction is clear. And if you don't agree, happy to debate later. So let's discuss a little bit what methodologies are well established. I think I've spent so long saying that crowdsourcing is a very promising technique that I think the time has passed, and this promise is all they can really be helpful in conservation. I'll give you a few examples. So this is a citizen science project I did with some high school students in a museum in Cardiff, the National Museum in Cardiff. It's the simplest form of citizen science. Rather than spending the time to do measurements ourselves, we use the opportunity to give this skill to some interested students that helped us monitor around the museum. It's a typical case of community involvement. The quality of the result is not affected because the instrument is the same. The only thing that's affected is that you dedicate more time into training people and so on. But the results we obtained in this afternoon were indeed very useful for the museum for their own risk assessment. That's one type of citizen science, but the spectrum is really wide. Sometimes it involves the community, but sometimes it even gets closer to spying on the community. That's another example. That's on the edges of what could be called crowdsourcing, and it's more towards social media analysis. This is work of one of my students that they were looking, interpreting heritage sites as a function of the level of engagement displayed in social media. So the number of tweets made from different locations that show, I like to say, the beating heart of the city with their frequency. This is in Chinatown in London. Of course, the most common type of citizen science is relying on the powerful computers that we all carry in our pockets. I already commented on this when I was giving my previous lecture in the academy on dust deposition, on the potential that the smartphones have to capture data that we are interested in for preventive conservation. So a lot of research in this domain has been focused most of the research in this domain perhaps has been focused on trying to see what we can see with the smartphones. We can see color, we can see shape. How good are these measurements? I consider that this avenue of research, it's maybe not the most exciting one because there are many answers already. Perhaps we have more answers than open questions in this area of color and shape capture with the smartphones. But I'll give you, for the sake of completion, an example of what the results look like. This is a case study I did with a student where we placed color calibration charts in a collection, and we were asking visitors to take images, and we were then evaluating whether these images rendered the colors correctly. What we wanted to see is whether we could measure color change using pictures submitted by visitors. The kind of results that you obtain with this are shown in this image. This shows an example of the B coordinate on a LAB color system, indicating a comparison between the values measured from smartphones after calibration using the color chart and the real value of the colors obtained with a colorimeter. The image on the right shows these results summarized for a diversity of colors. So for each color, you obtain a precision and accuracy. So a distance from the correct value and a spread of the results. You can see that it is very good for some colors, particularly from white to black. It is not so good for others, but that's just the analysis we did in 2018. Indeed, other people has reproduced this result, produced better correlations with more images. And I would say it can be considered now quite well established that you can use smartphones for colorimetry, even if there's a diversity of our smartphones, a diversity of lighting conditions, and a diversity of colors. You can use them for colorimetry in a museum context. I think we are pretty sure of that now. And it's time to explore not if it can be done, but how it can be done to improve preventive conservation. One of the areas perhaps where it could be tested, and I'm mentioning this just as an example, is in the analysis of fading. Not seeing the objects fade, even though that could happen, but for example, seeing how dosimeters fade. The image here shows a blue wool dosimeter, so it's a piece of blue textile that fades at a known rate when exposed to known doses of light. This curve that the plot shows is a typical loss of color of one of these samples of blue wool in response to different losses of light. So if you know how much the color has changed, you could infer the accumulated light dose that has incited into the material. You can see that these values of delta E, the change in color, have an order of magnitude that it's quite similar or actually bigger than the ones I was showing before that we can measure with the system. So for example, here a light dose of 200 kilolux corresponds to a delta E of 6. You could go back to this chart and see for the blue color, you actually have an uncertainty of 0.3 in one case, plus minus 8 in another. So we are quite close to being able to measure this in some instances. And mind you, this is with my correlation that it's not the best that has been published. Better models exist. But I would like to abandon indoor environments now because they are a little bit controlled in terms of lighting conditions, for example. And I would like to show you more challenging studies made in outdoor environments. I had a project with a PhD student, later postdoctoral researcher, Rosie, and funded by Historic Environment Scotland, where we conducted citizen science experiments in 20 approximately of their sites, all of them outside and with a great diversity of conditions. We collected so much data that we haven't had time to analyze it all. In fact, we have only analyzed 2 or 3 case studies. It's so difficult to analyze because we got so much that there are different stories to tell about each of them. It's almost like each of them could be the focus of a PhD, really. But I'll show you a couple of examples so you know what I mean. So this is a typical example. There's a site, it's a circle of stones that Rose is standing at the center, and we put these signs that was asking people to contribute pictures. We did this during COVID. At the start, we got many contributions. So this is an example of pictures submitted by Twitter. They could also submit pictures with WhatsApp, for example, or Instagram. We got hundreds and hundreds of submissions. We created some software that automatically compiled them, so we didn't have to go to Twitter and download the pictures one by one. This software is open source, and it can be adapted for any similar project. And since it was during COVID, the number of submissions was obviously affected by the lockdowns. So we had to try different strategies. What this image shows is on a specific site, the number of submissions that we got using 2 methods. This shows the months of the first COVID lockdown in 2020. In color yellow, you see what we called guided submissions. That means submissions done on site following the instructions explained in the little sign. So people would go to the site and we would ask them, take a picture that shows this rock or this other rock or the building from this angle. What we call open, it's submissions from home after requests in social media and also in local newspapers, asking pictures of any holiday or any historical picture that people may have that could help conservation of the sites. You can see that with both methods, we could get in a single day hundreds of submissions, that the ones from home really correspond to the moment of publication of news pieces in the media or on Twitter and so on. So every time there was a push, there was a response. There's a lot to learn from this. And perhaps we can examine it later in the Q&A as well. For example, it tells us that if we really want to maintain a momentum, we need continuous reminders. It also tells us that if you want daily pictures, You maybe cannot rely on this system for all types of sites. It also shows us that after the lockdown, there's a marked increase. There's a lot to say. We published a paper that tries to examine these trends a little bit. So what kind of things can we see with this data? I'll show you a couple of examples. This is a beautiful circle of stones in Scotland called Clava Cairns. It became really famous at some point, and this resulted in marked erosion of the entrance. Here you see a sequence of pictures, some of them submitted from home, from old holiday snaps, some of them taken by visitors on site. And you can see that this erosion of the grass just in front of site, it grows, it widens very easily. All the pictures are from the same angle because we were telling visitors to do so. Why is that? What was going on here? Well, you may know Outlander, a TV series that was extremely popular, and this site featured there. If you touch it, you're transported in time, and you can meet these gorgeous people. So many people took the pictures of themselves touching the site. In fact, if you look at the number of tweets about the site, there's an increase while Outlander was on TV. Even if not all the tweets mention Outlander, you can see in the orange line that only some tweets mention Outlander, but it drives the popularity of the place anyway, which I found quite interesting. So how do we quantify these results? In this instance, it was relatively easy, since all the pictures are from a similar angle, to capture the width of the erosion that we see on the main path, and the results are quite consistent. The trends are statistically significant, and when we can just put some numbers to what we see visually on the pictures. I'll show you a completely different example, a little bit more technological. As you may know, a common process in building conservation is to map the different building pathologies, the degradation patterns that can be seen on the building surface. There are, to this end, glossaries and standard ways to record these observations in plans of the building. One of the things that we were wondering is, could citizen science or crowdsourced data be used to automate this process, to see with the accumulation of photos taken daily by visitors in different sites, whether we can see not only how this process is in a year, but how this damage is in a certain year, but also perhaps how it changes seasonally. Of course, the technical challenges to do this are many. We had to create quite a sophisticated data science workflow. I'll show it to you in a moment. This is an example of how we were asking visitors to take pictures of a certain castle in Scotland, where there's different types of biological growth on the stone. Part of the castle is ruined, it has moisture problems and so on. It's in great condition in general, but it has interesting visual patterns. We were asking visitors to take pictures from a certain angle. Unfortunately, this did not happen so much. The angle that we were asking for, our instructions were a little bit vague, perhaps. We only asked for this area to be covered. You get, in my experience, better, more consistent angles if you ask for some feature to be included. For example, if you ask for the sign, the same sign that asks the question, to be included in the image, this tends to force people to stand on a certain position and so on. In this case, we were just asking for pictures that featured this window. And we also wanted to see how consistent the data would be. We got a great diversity, and we had to compensate for the diversity using data analysis. So trying to work with the diversity of angles. To understand this workflow, you need to start at the bottom left corner. Here you see some examples, the original photographs submitted by the visitors, different angles, different levels of zoom. We want to do two different things. First, we want to identify features on these walls, and then we want to quantify them. We want to know how big they are. if we follow the arrow that goes up, if we consider this direction of the workflow, what we are doing is something called semantic segmentation. That's a brand or a category of neural networks, of models. There are many out there. What they do is identifying words in a picture and describe it with words semantically. So it's basically an object detection neural network. It looks for objects and tells you that's a window, that's the sky, and so on. What we had to do is train it a little bit more to recognize useful things, because by default, it only recognizes mundane things, sky, benches, people, and so on. But that does not allow us a comparison of areas, because every picture is taken from a different angle. That would mean that if we count the pixels, or the pixels relative to the size of the window, or the pixels relative to the height of the picture, and so on, we get data that's not comparable. What we had to do to compare the data was align all these contributions on a 3D model of the building. Of course, we could go scan the building with a point cloud, scan the building with a laser, obtain a point cloud, and use this. But we are kind of crazy, and we thought it would also be fun to do the 3D model with the images submitted by the visitors. So what we did was obtain, we did photogrammetry with the images, which is this part of the workflow here. Photogrammetry gives us the camera angle of all the pictures, a good estimation of the camera position, and therefore it's enough information to then realign these pictures on top of the 3D model and be able to compare the area. So it can be done. It works really well. The only problem, if you can call it a problem, is that nothing changed during this year. So we could not, even though we are able to measure how area changes, and nothing changed in here. But if we continue to this, and indeed it's continuing, and hopefully there will be a small change that we can measure. This model, we try to train it to measure different things. That's an example of seeing how the vegetation cover changes, because we were hoping this could change quite fast, and it did. Ziwan used to say that he did his research on watching grass grow, and it's quite accurate. And you can see that it's very good if you train the model properly, and we trained it with additional data of grass growing on different things, not only on this castle, but we collected data of grass on things, so the model could recognize green foliage over bricks. It became quite good. The plot in the right, the way to read this is that you can look at the values at the center indicate basically which percentage of the identifications are correct. So it's very good with masonry. It's very good. It's excellent identifying the sky, and it identifies correctly the plants in 74% of the cases. But this is just to demonstrate that it can be done. And from here onwards, it's technological development. Almost, I wouldn't say it's not an academic question now, because the more computing power you put into it, the more images, the best it's going to work. Now, the question, as I said before, it's how to use this. We know it can be done, but how do we integrate it? How do we integrate these technologies in decision-making frameworks? That's the real question. Okay, to go to the final layer of complexity and show you what lies ahead in the field, I need to talk about this other platform called Zuniverse. I will erase this. Clear all drawings, perfect. So I need to talk about this platform. This is not a platform we have developed. That's been developed by Chris Lintott and colleagues, an amazing research group that started using crowdsourcing for astronomy. But the platform they have developed has been used across all the sciences, including cultural heritage, and we have used this platform a little bit on our own research. But instead than telling you about my own research, I want to tell you about their research, because they discovered something astonishing while doing it. So that's what they do. The first and most classical example of the use of Zuniverse is that you go online. You can do it right now if you want. You select Galaxy Zoo is a project within Zuniverse. It first trains you in how to identify galaxies, what's a galaxy, what's not a galaxy, and so on. And then it shows you images that no human has seen before. They come directly from the telescope, and it asks you, is that a galaxy or not? They had even some new objects, like this green thing, appeared for the first time in one of these images, and it was flagged by the person who was had to classify it. They posted in the forum, I have no idea what this is, and it turned out to be a new kind of object that has been named after that citizen scientist, actually. But that's not what I wanted to tell you about. What I want to tell you about is this very boring plot. Okay, it's the end of the talk. I know we've been through a lot, but I need your patience for one last slide of results, because I promise you understanding this plot pays off. What this is showing is two different results of identification of objects. HX at the x-axis, I'll have to make drawings. HX, it's a product of a machine learning model. So these guys have trained a machine learning model to predict whether an image shows a galaxy or not. So this model gives you a probability. It tells you, I think this is most certainly real, or no, it's actually an asteroid. Sometimes asteroids can look like galaxies. Or it tells you it's nothing. It was a pixel, it's absolutely nothing, and gives that a probability. 1 is most certainly, and 0 is it is not at all. Okay? This is a machine is doing that. On the y-axis, we have the same, but calculated from the contributions of the volunteers. So this is the value, the average value obtained by volunteers that are shown a picture. And if all of them say, yeah, absolutely, this is real, it's given a 1. But to put it simply, if half of them say, this is probably real, but others say, the other half say, this is not real, it's given half the score. So it's the same kind of classification by a machine and by a human. First observation, they do not correlate. Does it mean that the humans and the machine do not agree in their classifications? Is this graph showing us bad news? Well, the way I look at it, it's quite the opposite. Let's try to do this. My challenge for you is that you try to draw in here a line that on one side of the line, we have things that we will consider to be galaxies, and on the other side of the line, we will have things that we will classify as not galaxies. You can choose to make this line, for example. This line, it's an arbitrary threshold, and I'll say everything higher than 70% certainty, according to the machine, is a galaxy. Or I could use this line and say everything higher than 40% agreement with the human classificators is a galaxy. Wouldn't you agree with me that the best possible criteria is one that is diagonal, that takes into account both the input of the machine and the input of the humans? In other words, the humans and the machines are good at different things. The machines are good at finding things that look like other things that they have seen. The humans are very good at seeing only one thing and then finding another one that looks like it. So for example, if you see only once a crocodile, you'll see a crocodile, you'll identify a crocodile instantly. While a machine needs to see 1,000 million crocodiles, and then you'll show him a lizard and we'll still have doubts. That's a great limitation of machine learning. That's why all these bogus theories about machine learning take over the world do not worry me the least. Machine learning is only good at mundane things. Human brains are only good as exceptional things. In fact, we are quite bad at doing something in the same way all the time. So we need to collaborate. The nice message that this includes is, to put it in another image, perhaps more friendly, is that there is hope in the future collaboration between artificial intelligence and humans. We are living in Terminator 2, not Terminator 1. Just to wrap up, going back to the future, I started with the slide of the flat talking about the past. I'll use it again now to talk about the future, because the past of citizen science is the future of citizen science. The same example I showed initially is what we should be exploring now. In other words, we have established pretty well that our current technical capacity allows us to obtain good measurements, sometimes with more effort than in other instances, but always allows us to do so. Our technical capacity allows us to obtain good measurements from contributions by citizen scientists. The questions we should be asking ourselves right now, the interesting questions, are about the value of this. What do citizen scientists get from participating? What's the value of being a citizen scientist? What's the value to the individuals and to society? And is the scientific quality a function of this value? If someone contributes to a citizen science project, of course, we learn from the data that they have produced, but do we also learn about how people interact with heritage in general? And finally, getting inspiration from the Florence flat of '66, we need to wonder whether citizen science can be an interesting additional tool to add in the toolbox that communities have to deal with crises, including climate change. Can it help us raise not only awareness, but also help societies feel more empowered in the fight against climate change if they can contribute the measurements that are going to make a difference, and not only suffer the bad news through Twitter doom scrolling, for example. All very big questions that will take years to answer, and I know there's a lot of interest in this area. So maybe we are gradually getting there. That's everything from me. Before the Q&A, I'll leave it at this slide for you, Tiasa.
Well, first, thank you, Joseph, for this very insightful lecture. But yeah, let's give the audience a few moments to maybe write up their questions. And at this opportunity, I would like to announce the next Hyperion HS lecture. It will be given by Sara Talamo on the topic of timing the spread of creative innovations by Homo sapiens and Neanderthals using radiocarbon dating.